So in this session, we'll carry on and shift our gears from the reproductive system or reproductive hormone about the gender basis. And let's see what goes on inside our skeletal. And we'll talk about the calcium and the phosphate homeostasis. And in relation to that, we talk about the three hormones in particular, the PTH, calcitonin, and vitamin D3. The importance of calcium, while we are looking at the cell physiology, we look at the intracellular and extracellular fluids and what predominates each of them. So for example, sodium, we say predominantly it's an extracellular anion together with calcium, while potassium is majorly an intracellular. So we also did mention something about calcium, that calcium is majorly an extracellular cation, but a small amount of it is available inside the cell. And among the function it plays in the body, it's involved in several processes. We'll later talk, when you reviewed, about the muscle system, so the excitability and the contraction of the muscle. So your ability to move your hand right now, or your ability to talk, is because of the contraction of the muscles. So specifically the skeletal muscles, and that one utilizes calcium. It has a modified transformation of a certain organelle at the endoplasmic reticulum. So in skeletal muscle, it is transformed into a very big storage of calcium. And so when that storage is releases, it causes contraction of muscles. When you reviewed later another system on the blood, that is the clotting system, the intrinsic and the extrinsic pathway, all of them meet somewhere, and where they meet, there's a point where calciums come in, and calcium will be required for the clotting process to take place. And usually if you ever donated blood, usually there's a small tube for blood collection that usually has some blue purple top. If you look inside, it has what we call an anticoagulant, and that anticoagulant could be in a form of calcium citrate. And the purpose is only to precipitate calcium in blood, and once you take calcium out of blood, the blood will not be able to clot. We'll see the implication of that one. And in hormonal secretion processes or enzymatic regulation, calcium equally has a function it plays. In that, at the end stages, we have the calcium channels, and they need to open. At the heart, your heartbeat right now, your heart is beating at a rate between 60 to 90. And for that beating to take place, some calcium channels has to open and close. And that one causes the excitation of the cardiac myocytes. And we'll see the importance of that one later. And also the neuronal activity, so your neurons to be excited, also requires the calcium channels to open and close. And due to these all reasons, so calcium is a tightly regulated an ion. In fact, the regulation is so tightly controlled that it comes quite close to that one of potassium. And we later realized that both of them work very closely together, that where we have calcium channels, we equally have potassium channels, and both of them work together in a rather synchronized way to bring about the final effect. So phosphorus is equally essential. So we have something like ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So it means it has 3 molecules of phosphate. And once you cleave one, so energy will be released. So it's an energy storage form. And we did talk about how hormones work and the several mechanisms of how hormones work. And an example of that hormone will be the parathyroid hormone, which is it has about 84 amino acid, and something that is made up of amino acid, meaning it's a polypeptide. It's unable to cross the cell membrane because it's not lipid soluble, unlike an hormone that we talked previously, for example, the T3, T4, the thyroid hormone, which are lipid soluble. So the ones that are not lipid soluble binds to the cell receptors, and through a translocation, so they form the secondary messengers. An example of a secondary messengers is what we call the cyclic adenosine monophosphate. which is actually derived from ATP. So it's equally made up of phosphate. So those are a few examples or the function of the phosphate, and it's equally regulated in the body. So in terms of the normal ranges, in the body, 99% of calcium and about 88% of phosphate are available in the skeletal. So means they are reserved in the bones. And in that form, it's not a utilizable form. So the extracellular or the one in serum form a range of about 8.5 to 10 milligram per deciliter. And of that, about half of it is in free form, what you call the ionizable form that can easily diffuse, and that is the biological active one. So the free form is the one that the cells utilizes to cause muscle contraction or to cause blood clotting processes, is the active form that the cells require. So equally to phosphate, we say the normal concentration is about 3 to 4.5 mg per dl, and so the 80% is in the diffusible state, and the rest are bind to it. And we equally stated that ATP, cyclic AMP, and some protein. And it's equally important to note that phosphate is entirely an intracellular. So quick review about the bone cells type. And so of physiological importance, I know here the 4 type, but the osteoblast are the bone forming cells. These are the ones that secrete calcium and phosphate. And then we have the osteocyte. These are the mature bone cells that make up the bone. And then we have the osteoclast. So the osteoclast, usually they are large and multinucleated. And we later talk about the immune system and talk about specific types of blood cells called the monocyte. So when the monocytes are taken into a different type of the body, we give them a different name. So when you go to the bone, we label them to be osteoclast. And for example, when you take them into the tissue, we call them the macrophages. And if you take them to the brain, we call them the microglia. So those are the names that we give to the monocytes that have been taken into tissue and transformed to other type of cells. And the purpose of that one is to break down the bone in a process called the bone resorption. So let's see how the first two, the osteoblast and osteocyte, because they have receptors, and how they regulate the hemostasis of calcium. So calcium or the transfer of calcium is because of the activity of the osteocytic and the osteolysis process. So the osteocyte transfer calcium from the canaliculi into the extracellular fluid, and that transfer doesn't break down the bone. It's only a transfer of calcium without breaking down the bone mass. And that one distinguishes it from the other form, which is called the osteolysis, as the one that occurs, for example, during the process of menopause. So the resorption, it doesn't, unlike the first process of osteocytic osteolysis. So the bone resorption causes the extraction of calcium, but on the process, it diminishes the bone mass and it breaks down the mass, and the density equally reduces. And the cells responsible for that one is the osteoclast. So the classic example is the one process that occurs during a postmenopause, when the effect of estrogen has reduced so much. We'll see later how that one comes into play. So these are the example of the stimulant and the inhibitor of the bone formation. So for example, the growth hormone, the insulin estrogen causes the bone to be formed, and it's inhibited by cortisol. While the bone resorption, which is to break down the bone, is under the effect of the parathyroid hormone, the vitamin D, and the steroid hormone, and many other, but those are the most significant one. So those are the two distinct processes. So one, bone formation, we deposit calcium, and bone resorption, we break down the bone matrix, and on the process, calcium is released. So the hormonal control of calcium metabolism in the body, as I said initially, is under the regulation of the 3 hormones. So one is a parathyroid hormone. So the second one is calcitonin, and the third one is a vitamin. But that vitamin, once it transformed into another form, it acts as a hormone, and that is the vitamin D. So specifically, we call it vitamin D3 once it has been transformed. The organ involved in all these processes are three. We have the bones, where we have the reservoir for calcium. We have the kidneys, where usually the body loses calcium. And then finally, we have the intestines. And once we get the food supplement that are rich in calcium, we get them through the GIT, and specifically the absorption happen at the small intestine, the proximal part of it. So here we still have a same diagram outlining the same processes, that we have the bone here, and we have the kidney. In between them, we have the extracellular fluid, the normal ranges of calcium of between 8 to 5, but we say that the ionized form is usually half the serum level. So that will give you a range of about between 4 to 5. And then we have the dietary supplement that we take them through the GIT. So it's still a schematic diagram in an algorithmic form, that here we have the ingestion of calcium. So the calcium-rich food, we usually get them mostly from the animal product, unpasteurized, all the dairy product, all the seafood, including the sardines or the aquatic cockroaches, or other people call it omena, are the major sources of calcium. And once after digestion, they are absorbed. But absorption requires something else. It requires an activated form of vitamin D, which we later see that. And finally, after absorption, so the one that is absorbed will be in the blood, or the ionized form, or the serum form. So some of it will be bind to protein, majorly albumin and globulin, but the rest will be lost if it is in excess. So the kidney will shed off the excess form of it. And but the rest of it will be taken into the bones, and that will act as a reservoir, and that one is called the process of calcification. Later on, when the body needs it, and perhaps at that time, maybe you are not getting it through the diet and the need is immediate, so the bones will be commanded to break down and release it into the blood. And if we get an excess part of it again, so the resorption, a signal will be given that the bone should stop breaking down, and the kidney will do the function of filtering out the excess. And through all these three organs, the level is maintained at that very narrow range because of the importance it has. So quickly, let's talk about vitamin D. So vitamin D later become an hormone. And as I say that, we get it through the diet, but also we get it from our skin. So at the dermis level, we have a cholesterol, and that cholesterol is in form of the 7-dehydrocholesterol. And once that cholesterol is subjected to a UV light, so the UV light will transform it into a provitamin D3. And the provitamin D3 will be taken to the liver, and hydroxylation will happen, and one hydroxyl will be added, and it becomes vitamin D3. So at that state, we call it the 25 hydroxycholecalciferol. And that one will be transported into the liver. At the liver, another hydroxyl will be added, and it becomes 125 hydroxycholecalciferol, or simply the activated vitamin D3. And at that state, it becomes an hormone. So let's see quickly what that hormone does. So the main action of 125 dehydroxycholecalciferol, or in simple, you can see in that abbreviation, we write 125 dehydroxycholecalciferol, or simply call it vitamin D3, means it has been activated. So this is the stimulant that causes absorption of calcium from the intestine. Without it, absorption will not be able to take place. And we later see the significance of that one in relation to how some conditions such as rickets will come into place. So the activated vitamin D3 will induce production of some receptors at the small intestine. So we simply call it the calcium binding protein. And that calcium binding protein is what causes the absorption of calcium from the small intestine. So the exact processes, we'll learn them later when we review about the GI tract and the process of absorption. But just note down that for the absorption of calcium from the diet to take place, an activated form of vitamin D3 is required to cause the formation of receptors at the intestines. And the receptors are called the calcium binding proteins. Note that one down. So vitamin D, so it also acts like other steroidal hormone, and the process of that one is the same as the gene transcription. We saw the process of gene transcription and the protein synthesis from the earlier part of cell physiology 1, and the process is still the same, but the signal cascade is initiated by activated vitamin D3. So another important target of activated vitamin D3 is the bone. So it binds to the osteoblast, and once it binds to the osteoblast, so it produces a paracrine activity, which will cause the activations of the osteoclast to reabsorb calcium from the bone. So we say we have two cells. We have the osteoblast, and usually that one is involved in the bone formation. And then we have the osteoclast that causes the breaking down of the bone. Here, vitamin D3 doesn't bind directly into the target cells, which is the osteoclast, because the aim is to increase the level of calcium. But instead, it binds to the osteoblast, and the osteoblast will give another signal into the osteoclast to cause the bone resorption. And that processes where one cell causes an effect on the adjacent cell. We call that a paracrine activity. So the opposite will be the endocrine, what we are talking about, that one hormone will cause an effect in the distal, a very remote part of the body, for example. But if the effect of that hormone is on the adjacent cells, we call that one the paracrine activity. And if that cell was causing a changes within its own cell inside, and then we call that one an autocrine. So I think I must have highlighted, and if I didn't highlight, I should have highlighted at the beginning of the introduction to endocrine, that the modalities in which the cells control their activities is through those three processes of paracrine, autocrine, and endocrine. Let's proceed. So the activated vitamin D3 or 1,25-hydrocolcalciferols also stimulate the osteocytic activity, meaning it causes the process of bone resorption. So proper bone formation is usually stimulated by vitamin D3. So what happened then in its absence? So for example, let's say we have a child who usually don't get exposed to the sun, maybe someone born in some remote places where they don't experience sunlight in sufficient amount, such as in the polar region during the winter. So in the absence, you won't be able to have the activated form of vitamin D3, meaning if you still get sufficient amount from the diet, but the receptors are not activated, you'll not be able to get a good amount of calcium in the body. And that one will result in a condition, we call it the rickets, which is quite rare. So that was, we have talked enough about the activated form of vitamin D3. So let's proceed and see the parathyroid hormone. So the parathyroid hormone, or PTH, is synthesized and secreted by the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid gland, from the word para, mean it lies adjacent to the thyroid gland, but it usually lies a little bit posterior. So the blood supply is from the thyroid arteries. And I think you also remember that thyroid artery is a branch of the main branch of the aorta. So within the parathyroid cells, we have the cells, specifically, we call them the chief cells. And the chief cells are the one responsible for the synthesis of PTH. In terms of the regulation of calcium, so the dominant regulator is the PTH hormone. So, and the secretion is in a negative control system. So you remember we talked about the two modalities of control of hormones, the positive and the negative control system. So all hormones uses the negative control system except oxytocin as we level initially. So the secretion is inversely correlated with calcium level, meaning when the calcium levels goes down, so the secretion increases, and when the calcium level goes high, it switches off the production of the parathyroid hormone. So the secretion usually occurs when the level goes below about 3.5. We give a range of between 8.8 to 10 mg per dl, and we say the ionosoluble form is between half of that one. So the half of that one will be between 4 to 5. And so the 3.5 will be the lower limit. And once it goes below 3.5 mg per dl, it signals the parathyroid gland to secrete the parathyroid hormone. And once that level increases above 5.5, so it will still inhibit it, and the production or the secretion of parathyroid hormone will instantly stop. What does it do? So let's see the action it does. So the overall is to increase the plasma calcium level, and on the process it has a negative effect on the phosphate, but for now let's focus on the calcium. How does it achieve that one? It acts directly to stimulate the calcium resorption, and it also acts on the kidney to cause a reabsorption from the distal convoluted tubule, and it inhibits reabsorption of calcium on the process. So it also acts directly on the intestine by stimulating the synthesis of vitamin D3. So that is still another diagram that gives you the interplay or the interchange between the kidney, the bone, and the intestine, and how the PTH takes place in all of that. So finally, let's talk about the last hormone. We call it the calcitonin. And the function is to reduce the calcium level. So the parathyroid will cause an increase, and the calcitonin will cause a decrease. So a classic example or the synonym for this will be the insulin and glucagon. And calcitonin will be equivalent to glucagon, and then we'll have the PTH will be so calcitonin will be synonymous with insulin, and PTH will be synonymous with glucagon. So have that picture in mind. So PTH and vitamin D, so they act to increase the calcium level. So it's only calcitonin that causes a decrease in the level. So it's synthesized by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. So they are released together from the same glands between the T3 and T4. But the cells that secrete them are distinct. They are a bit larger, and in a microscope, they have a slightly pale cytoplasm and small secretory granules. And these are the cells that secrete calcitonin. So the major stimulant of calcitonin is the rise in the plasma level of calcium. So once calcium level goes above 5.5, calcitonin will be released. So, and in an essence, at this point says that calcitonin is a physiological antagonist with PTH in regarding to the hemostasis. Once it's secreted, it inhibits the secretion of the other one. So it targets the osteoclast, and we remember that PTH, we say it targets the osteoblast. So it acts via secondary messengers because it's an amine, or it's a peptide made up of amino acids. And then it causes an inhibition of the osteoclast motility and shape, thereby inhibiting the activity. So the major effect is a rapid fall in the calcium levels and by the inhibition of the bone process. So in short, calcitonin will simply go to the bone and diminishes the activity of the osteoclast, which usually cause the bone resorption, thereby minimizing the release of calcium into the blood circulation. Well, that one brings us into the end. So we have utilized about 42 minutes explaining this intricate process. So the process, so once you get the team players for all these processes, it becomes quite straightforward. So hormones involved in it are PTH, calcitonin, and activated form of vitamin D3. And we say vitamin D3, we get it through the diet, and we equally get it through the skin, and it has to be transformed from the inactive form, and the precursor is cholesterol. That cholesterol will be transformed into a pre-form of vitamin D, which will be taken into the liver, and hydroxylation will happen, and it will be transformed into 25 dehydroxycholecalciferol, and the final transformation happen at the kidney, where we get the final form of 125 dehydroxycholecalciferol, or simply vitamin D3. And vitamin D3 will act on the intestine, and at the intestine, it will activate a receptor, and that receptor, the calcium binding protein, is required for the absorption. And it equally acts on the bones by binding into the osteoblast, and the osteoblast will in turn activate the osteoclast, and that one causes the process of bone resorption. When the calcium level goes high, and you also have to know the range, so the ionized form is between 3.5 to 5.5. So once the level goes below 3.5 down the bone, and it will also increase the reabsorption from the kidney, and the level will increase. If the level continues to increase until it surpasses 5.5, which will be the upper limit, the secretion of PTH will stop, and immediately calcitonin will be released. So calcitonin will stop the first effect of the osteoclast, meaning it will inhibit bone resorption, and the kidney will continue to lose the excess calcium, and a few of it will be deposited in the bone until the normal range is achieved again. So that is the summary of the calcium metabolism in the body. And that one brings us into the end. If you have any questions, you require any clarification, you can put it in the chat, or you can always raise your hand up and I'll be able to answer it.